يحاور الصحافي الإيراني اراش عزيزي حول كتابه قائد الظل سليماني والولايات المتحدة الأمريكية طموحات إيران العالمية. كتاب يختصر قصة قاسم سليماني، رجل في دولة مارقة. الصحافي الإيراني والباحث اراش عزيزي، بداية لماذا قاسم سليماني؟ لماذا كتبت عن قائد الظل قاسم سليماني?
Qasem Soleimani was always interesting for me because it is very rare in the contemporary world for a military general to be able to organize thousands of people from other countries, right? It's ordinary for people to join up their national armies and go and die for their country. But how is it that some people from other countries will join up an army to go die under the command of another country's army? That doesn't happen in history often. It has happened, and I talk about some instances of it in the book. But so this was interesting for me, that how Soleimani was able to build a transnational force. As I am always interested in the relationship of Iran with the Arab world, the links of Iran with the Arab world, the person of Soleimani. So I thought that through his life story, I can tell the story of how Islamic Republic came to have this relationship with the Arab world and to be able to dominate, frankly, political life in a number of Arab countries.
أستاذ أراش، يعني عنوان كتابك هو قائد الظل سليماني، الولايات المتحدة وطموح إيران العالمي. من هنا سؤالي لحضرتك بأن القادة في إيران يباهون أو أعلنوا أكثر من مرة بأن طهران تسيطر على 5 مدن عربية: بيروت، دمشق، بغداد، غزة وصنعاء، وذلك لبناء الهلال الشيعي أو ما يعرف بالهلال الشيعي لمواجهة القوى السنية التقليدية أو القوى السنية الوطنية في المنطقة. وهذا يعني أن النفوذ الإيراني أو الهلال الشيعي يبدأ في طهران وينتهي في صنعاء. هذا الواقع يقابله من يحلل بأن بعد أن أتم قاسم سليماني هذه المهمة كان لابد بأن يتم تصفيته أو قتله. هل حضرتك بتوافق على هذه النظرية؟
Well, I mean, if you ask me whether I agree if she should be killed, no, I basically don't agree, because it was, as the United Nations said, it was against international law. Assassinating military generals of other countries it's against international law, and frankly it's very, very rare. The United States has basically not done this since it killed a high-ranking Japanese general in the Second World War. He had never done that again. Of course, Soleimani himself broke international law many times, and he supported many terroristic activities in many countries. And it is also true that the US didn't just kill him out of the blue. He was escalating confrontation with the United States in Iraq. He really thought he was invincible. But yes, I do believe that the precedent of killing military leaders of other countries in targeted assassinations is not horribly great, frankly. It's very rare. Israelis really are the ones who do that, most regularly, really. I mean, and for the United States has usually limited this to leaders of stateless actors or like non-state actors, right? Basically terrorist groups. So the United States kills the leadership of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other groups like that.
لكن أستاذ أراش، يعني وحضرتك تقرأ في السياسة أنه في السنوات الأخيرة تعاظم نفوذ قاسم سليماني بشكل كبير جدا. وعادة في السياسة عندما يكبر نفوذ أحد القادة العسكريين أو السياسيين تأتي مرحلة ضرورة اختفائه، إن كان عن طريق التصفية أو إبعاده عن المشهد.
It is true that he was the head of a transnational army that did a lot of bad things. It was a challenge to sovereignty of Iraq. It was a challenge to sovereignty of Lebanon. That's for sure. He played a very malign role, very negative role in Palestine. The very story of Soleimani is the story of breaking all these agreements between the states. So perhaps someone can say, look, yes, you don't kill military generals of other countries, but when a military general makes his job to intervene in directly intervene in political affairs of so many states, he makes himself fair game to be killed. I'm sympathetic to that point.
ماذا خسرت إيران باغتيال قاسم سليماني؟
Iran lost a lot of things. In fact, Soleimani has basically been proved irreplaceable. I can say this with a degree of confidence more than a year after he was killed. His successor, Ismail Qaani, has not been able to sort of fill those shoes. In fact, Iran has basically decided that, look, we're not going to have another Soleimani, so let's not even try. Of course, they try to make a martyr out of him, and they try to use his death. But the reality is, Iran does not have anymore a commander who's able to so seamlessly move between the countries, who has a charisma and a personal relationship with the leadership of these Iraqi Shia groups, with Lebanese Hezbollah and others. So Iran has lost a lot by losing Soleimani. And of course, losing Soleimani is not the only point. Two other points have meant that the whole project of the Quds Force has been severely weakened. First of all, the 2 points are, first of all, in Lebanon and in Iraq, since the fall of 2019, you have a movement of people against Iranian influence, against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and against Iraqi Shia militias in Iraq. Although it's not really just against Hezbollah and against Iraq, it's about it's really against it's against the sectarian political system, and it's against the way Iran has been able to use it to its benefit in Iraq and Lebanon. I wish every success to the movement in Lebanon and to the movement in Iraq for asserting the sovereignty of these countries and to getting rid of the sectarian political system that has really allowed outsiders to rule over their affairs. That's number one. The number two is that the maximum pressure policy of President Trump means that Iran has been severely weakened in its capabilities, and including in its financial capabilities. And for that reason, it does not have the same amount of money and largesse to give to Hezbollah and to give to Iraqi militia groups. Iran in its worst financial shape that it's been in a very long time. So as a result, Soleimani's killing is just the cream, on the top, basically, the icing on the top of the cake that has meant Iran's project of Quds Force and the so-called axis of resistance is severely weakened.
في أحد تصريحاتك بأن على الرغم من اغتيال قاسم سليماني واختفائه من المشهد السياسي والعسكري، ولكنك أبديت قلق من أن تتحول إيران إلى ديكتاتورية عسكرية. يعني ما سبب هذا القلق؟
The military dictatorship is not really about Soleimani. The reason I'm worried about that is that the most powerful force in Iranian society and politics for some time now has been the IRGC, Haras-e-Suri, as you call it in Arabic, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. This is a group of which Soleimani was a leading figure, and today it controls half of Iranian economy. It obviously controls all levels of its military. Effectively, the national Iranian army, it is the main force that controls the Persian Gulf, for example, Iranian military capabilities in the Persian Gulf. It's the force that builds the missiles. It controls much of the country's foreign policy. It controls the country's national police force, and it controls many of its politicians. So the IRGC, which is a military force, is effectively the most powerful force in Iran. If an IRGC candidate, let's say someone like Saeed Mohammad, a little-known figure that is very likely to run, becomes president in the presidential elections that are coming in June in Iran, Iran would be well on its way to become a military dictatorship, especially after the death of Ayatollah Khamenei, the current supreme leader. So, the possibility of Iran turning into a military dictatorship is really high.
يعني كما هو معروف بأن النظام الإيراني استعان بمجموعات شيعية موالية له بشكل كبير للسيطرة على عدد من الدول العربية، وذلك تحت قيادة قاسم سليماني، أو كان قاسم سليماني هو من يقود هذه المجموعات الشيعية. وكلنا نعلم بأن أحداث السابع من أيار ب 2008 التي اجتاح فيها حزب الله بيروت كانت غرفة العمليات تدار تحت إشراف قاسم سليماني. وأيضا بحرب تموز بال 2006 كان له دور كبير جدا في إدارة العمليات العسكرية مع حزب الله. والأهم من ذلك أن الحراك الشعبي أو انتفاضة 17 تشرين ب 2019 كان قاسم سليماني هو من أعطى التعليمات بنفسه لقمع الثوار أو بمعنى أصح لإنهاء التحركات الشعبية في لبنان. لماذا كان قاسم سليماني ممتعض وغاضب من التحركات الشعبية في لبنان أو من انتفاضة 17 تشرين؟
سليماني led a transnational political military group that was under the ideological influence of Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran that Soleimani had served loyally all these years. The coming out of Lebanese and Iraqi protesters in the fall of 2019, of course, it worried Soleimani because it weakened Khamenei's and Tehran's influence in these countries. So while I cannot, it's too recent, I'm a historian, so I like things to pass a little before I can, I can look at the documents and issue exact judgments. I'm not sure what exactly was the role of Soleimani, but there is no doubt that this was bad news for Soleimani and for Khamenei, because a democratic Iraq, a democratic Lebanon, a active democratic citizenry in Iraq and Lebanon is bad news for Islamic Republic. Islamic Republic rules in these countries by keeping them weak and divided, and under conditions that are conducive to forces like Hezbollah.
أقرت المحكمة الدولية الخاصة باختيار رئيس الحكومة الأسبق رفيق الحريري بأن أحد عناصر حزب الله هو من قتل رفيق الحريري. يعني وبمنطق الأمور يعني أن أحد عناصر حزب الله لا يجرؤ على القيام بهكذا عمل من دون أن يكون قد حصل على تكليف من القيادة العليا في حزب الله باغتيال رفيق الحريري. وأيضا هناك من يقول وتكثر يعني الترجيحات والتحليلات بأن حزب الله لا يستطيع أن يتخذ قرار بهذا الحجم باغتيال شخصية كبرى مثل رفيق الحريري دون العودة إلى قيادته المركزية في إيران. هل أعطى قاسم سليماني أوامره لحزب الله من أجل اغتيال رفيق الحريري?
That's a big question, Asma. I mean, the international court that you mentioned, didn't name Hezbollah, right? Named some Hezbollah members as people who have killed it. Of course, I think the dominant theory is that Hezbollah with Syria, probably with the coordination with Syria, the Assad's government in Syria, killed Hariri. I haven't done enough investigation to know of this. 2005, it's an interesting question. With killing of Hariri in 2005, was it under Soleimani's order? I don't know. To be honest, I don't know. I haven't found anything that shows that.
ولكن أستاذ اراش يعني إذا وضعنا البازل مثل ما بنقول أمامنا على الطاولة وفككنا المشهد سنجد أن بدء تعاظم أو ظهور نفوذ حزب الله في لبنان بدأ بعد اغتيال رفيق الحريري بعام 2005. زاد هذا النفوذ بشكل واضح وبات حزب الله هو المسيطر على السلطة في لبنان عام 2008 عندما اجتاح بيروت في أحداث السابع من أيار. وبالتالي المنطق يقول أن إزاحة رفيق الحريري من المشهد كانت ضرورية كي يتحول حزب الله إلى الحاكم الفعلي للبنان.
Okay, if you're analyzing, yes, killing of a popular prime minister that led to increase Hezbollah's role, through the link that Hezbollah also built with the Onat movement there, with the what's it called, Free Patriotic Movement of Michel Aoun, really favored Iran in a very major way. But did Soleimani order the killing of Rafiq Hariri? Well, I haven't seen any evidence for that.
ولكن أستاذ اراش مهمتنا كصحفيين هي القراءة والتحليل في المشهد السياسي. وحتى الأمين العام لحزب الله حسن نصر الله دائما ما يعلن ويقول بأن مرجعية حزب الله هي الجمهورية الإسلامية الإيرانية، وحتى تمويل الحزب وميزانيته تأتي من إيران. يعني بالتالي كيف يقتل حزب الله رفيق الحريري دون موافقة إيرانية؟
Okay, I'll tell you this. If you're correct to say, if Hezbollah had made a decision to kill Rafiq Hariri in 2005, it is unlikely that Iran was not informed. Yes, of something that important, Nasrallah would have let Khamenei know about it. That's for sure, right? They would have coordinated in this regard. But you know, Hezbollah has always been controlled by Iran from day one. It has been created by Iran and it's pretty much controlled by Iran. This is a very important point because they sometimes pretend otherwise. But yes, for example, this information about Hezbollah being created by Iran, I get it from Nasrullah's memoirs. You know, he says in his memoirs that he explains very clearly how the IRGC and the Iranians, not in some indirect way, not in an inspirational way, in a direct way, created Hezbollah and ran Hezbollah. So it is clear that they wouldn't have taken a decision as big as that without Iranian influence.
أستاذ اراش، أريد أن أتوقف عند أحد تصريحاتك وأيضا الوارد في كتابك. حضرتك تقول بأن حزب الله كان جزء من ثورة حقيقية عند بداية تأسيسه، ثم أصبح ديكتاتورية طائفية لاحقا. ماذا تقصد بذلك؟
So Hezbollah had of course started by a bunch of revolutionaries who wanted, like all revolutionaries, wanted to change the world. They had high goals. They saw themselves as followers of Khomeini in Iran, and they had lofty ideals. And if you read the documents that they had in the 1980s, they had high ideals that they wanted to change the world in their own way. But really what happens by the 90s is that Iran itself turns into a much more straightforward capitalist country, right? A capitalist dictatorship. And Hezbollah serves the Iranian goals there. So it is auxiliary of a capitalist dictatorship. And in Lebanon itself, Hezbollah does not become a liberatory force for the Lebanese Shia as it claimed. It becomes a capitalist force that represents really middle class and upper middle class, some middle class and upper middle class and bourgeois sections of the Lebanese Shia. You can see it with your own eyes in the fall of 2019 when the Lebanese people come out and shout Thورة, revolution. Hezbollah is there, but not alongside them. It is there to suppress them. It was interesting, for example, that when I was actually in Lebanon during the movement to sort of report on it, and it was interesting for me that the Lebanese Communist Party, for example, that historically some wing of the Lebanese Communist Party had some affinity with Hezbollah. They saw it as an anti-Zionist force. They have fought together actually against the Israeli occupation. But by the time of the movement, I think they were disgusted at Hezbollah because of the way they saw it sided with who? With the sectarian order and with Gebran Basel, the most hated man in Lebanon perhaps in that period. Hezbollah killed a lot of Lebanese communists in the 80s. It had a role in putting down the Lebanese workers whenever they went on a strike. It has never been a genuine revolutionary force. The events of the past few years have proved it ever more to be a protector, a linchpin of a corrupt capitalist order.
أستاذ اراش، تقول أيضا بأن بعد انحصار داعش في العراق أو انتهاء حالة داعش إذا جاز التعبير لم يربح العراق بل خسر العراق. العراق ذو سيادة منقوصة، الشعب العراقي منقسم على ذاته، تتنازعه الطائفية بشكل كبير، لا يوجد إجماع على الجيش العراقي بسبب وجود العديد من القوات العسكرية على الأرض، والأهم العراق بلد مفلس أو شبه مفلس في أحسن الأحوال. وأرجعت هذا الواقع إلى التدخل الإيراني في العراق والذي نفذه بحذافيره قاسم سليماني. هذا الواقع بالضبط ينطبق على لبنان. هل يمكن القول أستاذ اراش بأن قاسم سليماني هو من يتحمل مسؤولية الانهيار الذي وصل إليه لبنان اليوم؟
He is to a good degree. Soleimani integrated Lebanon, which is after all a small country, into Iran's designs for a regional war, right? He took Hezbollah and strengthened it, gave it a lot of financial and military power. It involved it in civil wars in Iraq and Syria, in Yemen and in other countries. So it is true that by integrating Lebanon into this regional civil war and by giving power to Hezbollah, Soleimani is partially responsible for the problems Lebanon finds itself in. And, not to mention the fact that, of course, Soleimani was more powerful than vast majority of Lebanese politicians, really, in Lebanon. Whenever you have that, of course, your sovereignty is compromised. Soleimani probably was more powerful in deciding the fate of Lebanon than most Lebanese presidents and prime ministers of the last 10 years or so. Integrating this small country into a big war in which the residents of Lebanon really have no interest, right? Lebanon should have a relationship with Iran, it should have a relationship with Syria, it should have a relationship, but also with Saudi Arabia, with Jordan, with Egypt, as it historically has had since the Second World War. Why should Lebanon, for example, now face all sorts of international sanctions because it was doing Iran's bidding? It is not in the interest of the Lebanese citizens for their small country to become a scene of big powers basically meddling, and and for different religious groups, sort of sectarian groups in Lebanon, to become pawns of power by big powers. Now, this has happened a lot in the history of Lebanon. Iran is not the first one who tries to use the Shia population for its own interest. So I think the movement that you have in Lebanon, and it faces a very tough task, but because the Zuama, the sectarian powers. So I think the direction, it's the same direction that you had in the Cedar Revolution, and you have it now, but it's for a independent, sovereign, non-sectarian Lebanon. These are heavy political tasks, and you can't do them by just protesting in the streets and going. You need a political will. You need political vehicles. You need building political tools, and this means political compromise. This means putting forces together. And the Zuama, the political leaders of today, have to be part of the solution in some way. Some of them, right? I'm sure that Walid Jombalat would be happy to be part of a independent sovereign non-sectarian Lebanon.
لكنهم جميعا يخافون من حزب الله.
Well, Walid Jombalat did speak against Hezbollah, pretty strongly in recent years, and including a couple of weeks. My basic point is that I think the people of Lebanon have shown their desire. I think majority of people of Lebanon want a country that is independent, sovereign, and non-sectarian. After all, for a sectarian system of Lebanon to go is the goal of the even Taif agreement, right? People think Taif agreement supports the sectarian system, but it kind of doesn't, right? Taif agreement says the sectarian system is temporary and that it opens the way to Lebanon's constitution. That is non-sectarian. So I think that's the direction. But in politics, for political goals to happen, you need to organize politically. And unfortunately, this is something that a lot of young people who love to, protest in the movement, they haven't necessarily done that. And when I was there, they would say all these, frankly silly things like, that, well, kollon yani kollon, all in all, it sounds great as a slogan. But if you want to make a political movement, well, Lebanon has elections. You need to be able to organize in these elections and use political tools and as they exist to advance your goals.
حضرتك توصف العلاقة بين حزب الله والجمهورية الإسلامية الإيرانية وفق مثلثين. المثلث الأول يجمع حسن نصر الله، قاسم سليماني وعماد مغنية. المثلث الثاني يجمع قاسم سليماني وحسن نصر الله وخامنئي. على ماذا استندت لوصف هذه الحالة أو شبكة العلاقة بين حزب الله وإيران؟
As you know, when they had the first general secretary, Subhi Tufaili, there was falling out between Iran and Hezbollah. They were able to quickly capture it again. And Nasrallah is the next level of Iranian control because he has even a much more closer personal relationship with Ayatollah Khamenei and with the Iranian leadership. And after the killing of Mousavi, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, by Israelis, Nasrallah came to power. Now, 1998 is when Soleimani was appointed the head of the Quds Force. And as part of his portfolio as the head of the Quds Force, he was in charge of all pro-Iran, allies of Iran in the region. Hezbollah also became part of his job and his portfolio for the first time. So Soleimani had a very close relationship to Emad Moghnieh and Nasrallah, and that this triangle was very important because Nasrallah was the political head, and Emad Moghnieh, was a personal friend of Soleimani, but he was a very operational guy. They were almost like two military geeks together, and they were both very talented. They were similar in a way. They were very talented, very strategic, very, they weren't talking men, they were acting men. And you can see the very good example of this in the 2006 Lebanon-Israel war, or I guess Israel-Hezbollah war, in which Soleimani is able to enter Lebanon, during the war twice, actually. He comes in, out, and in again. Soleimani goes to Syria. Emad Moghnieh goes near the border. Emad Moghnieh comes and picks him up. It was a big thing to be able to smuggle Soleimani in the middle of the war, when Israelis were, raining down. This relationship was important, and the Khamenei, Nasrallah, Soleimani relationship was also very important because Khamenei was the political commander of both of them, and he could, he had two strong political and military leaders in case of Soleimani, and that he could coordinate them together. Two triangles are very important because with Soleimani Nasrallah Moghnieh meant a political military coordination of Hezbollah, and Soleimani Nasrallah Khamenei meant a political coordination, political strategic coordination of the whole axis of resistance.
دعنا نذهب إلى الملف اليمني وحضرتك فاجأتنا جميعا وفاجأت قرائك بما ورد في كتابك في الملف اليمني حينما قلت بأن الرئيس اليمني الأسبق علي عبد الله صالح قد تم اغتياله بواسطة أو بناء على أوامر إيرانية ومن قاسم سليماني تحديدا. السؤال البديهي: لماذا تقدم إيران على اغتيال حليفها علي عبد الله صالح?
First of all, the question of why he had become a problem for Iran. Well, they had the alliance between Saleh and Houthi had broken down, and they were worried that Saleh was able to make a rapprochement with Saudi Arabia. Saleh had been a president of Yemen for more than 30 years, according to himself, because he knew how to dance on the heads of snakes, right? He knew how to balance out different tribal interests in Yemen and stay in power. So they were worried that he will use some of his touch again to be able to form a new Yemeni government that would be detrimental to Iranian interests. So they were worried about him. But why kill him? I believe it's because Soleimani had grown so prideful, if you were, so full of hubris in the last year of his life that he thought he could do anything. And so Saleh was a problem. Now Soleimani felt, get rid of him. And this is an important pattern in the last couple of years of Soleimani's life. He threatened Pakistan with military attack out of a very small border incident. He threatened Bahrain with a coup. He threatened Donald Trump repeatedly, right? And speech after speech, he would taunt Trump. And this was part of a pattern in the last couple of years of his life that Soleimani thought he was bigger than life and he was all powerful. Of course, the events showed that he wasn't that powerful after all, and then an American drone could kill him like anybody else.
إذا تتبعنا مسار العلاقة بين إيران والحوثيين سنجد أن إيران ليست مهتمة كثيرا بالملف اليمني مقارنة باهتمامها بالملف اللبناني أو الملف السوري أو الملف العراقي. فلماذا قد تقحم إيران نفسها في ورطة اغتيال رئيس جمهورية أسبق كعلي عبد الله صالح؟
Yemen matters a lot for Iran because it's a border state with the Saudi Arabia. It has a border with Saudi Arabia, and it has a very strategic position on the Bab al-Mandab, and it can help. It can frankly help strategically Iran's presence. So Iran does care about Yemen, and it has cultivated the relationship with the Houthis, trying to use the Shia links with the Houthis, even though Houthis are a very different sort of Shia altogether. They're Zaydis, as you know. They have tried to use that to their benefit.
بات معلوما أن حزب الله وإيران قاما بالتدخل العسكري في سوريا لإخماد الثورة السورية والحراك الشعبي في سوريا من أجل دعم نظام الأسد. ومن بعد ذلك قام حزب الله وإيران بعملية تغيير ديموغرافي كاملة للمناطق الواقعة تحت نفوذ إيران وحزب الله، تحديدا في القصير والقلمون وغيرها من المناطق التي باتت تسيطر عليها إيران وحزب الله بشكل كامل، بمعنى أن العديد من السوريين قد تركوا منازلهم طوعا خوفا من القصف أو بسبب الأوضاع الإنسانية والأمنية غير الآمنة التي باتت تهدد حياتهم، وآخرين قد أجبروا على ترك منازلهم من قبل إيران ومن قبل حزب الله، وباتت هذه المناطق فارغة تماما من سكانها الأصليين السوريين، وتم جلب لبنانيين من الشيعة وعراقيين ومن السوريين العلويين وأيضا إيرانيين تم إسكانهم في المناطق التي سيطر عليها حزب الله وإيران كي تكون بيئة كاملة متكاملة حاضنة للنفوذ الإيراني. كيف تقرأ ذلك أستاذ اراش؟
Trying to change the demographics of Syria is in the interest of wanting to prolong the rule of Assad regime and more directly to prolong the Iranian influence. So it's obvious that why they would do that. Iran wants Syria to be a weak, divided place that is under the control of Assad regime, but also under the more sort of control of Iran. It wants its influence there to be more. So it's natural that that it would rely on different sort of demographic changes. I have to say that unfortunately all powers are doing a version of that. Turkey is in its own way has openly spoken about basically changing the ethnic makeup of northeast Syria.
الآن بعد اغتيال قاسم سليماني، هل يمكن القول بأن اللبنانيون والعراقيون باتوا على موعد قريب مع الحرية؟
Well, you definitely have the chance. I wrote this book because I believe that the people of our region, Iran and the Arab world, need to work together for democracy, for national independence and sovereignty of our countries, and there need to be more links between us. In Lebanon, as I spoke before, we need a movement that asserts Lebanese sovereignty and independence against the Iranian influence and a building of a strong Lebanese state that serves Lebanese first. And in Iraq, there are elections this year that are vitally important. In the October of this year, there are elections. It is the job of the UN, which has a heavy presence in Iraq, to make sure these elections are free and fair, to limit Iran's attempt at rigging the vote or influencing the vote.